What if the people who betrayed you were actually part of God's plan for your destiny? It is a question that seems impossible when you are at the bottom of a hole, looking up at the people who put you there. Joseph began his life in a position of extreme security. As the favorite son of the patriarch Jacob, he was draped in a coat of many colors, a clear signal of his father's preference. But Joseph was also given something far more heavy than a garment. He was given dreams. In these visions, he saw sheaves of grain, and even the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him. To Joseph, these were messages of a bright future. To his family, they were a threat. Joseph did not keep these visions to himself. He spoke of them often, and with every story, the resentment among his 10 older brothers grew. They saw a younger brother who was not only their father's favorite, but who now claimed a divine right to rule over them. This wasn't a simple sibling rivalry. It was a bitterness that had reached a breaking point. They began to see Joseph not as a brother, but as an obstacle that needed to be removed. The breaking point came in the wilderness of Dothan. When they saw Joseph approaching from a distance, they didn't see a teenager. They saw a dreamer they could finally silence. They stripped him of his famous coat, the symbol of his status, and threw him into a dry well. As he cried out from the darkness, they sat down to eat a meal. Shortly after, they sold him for 20 pieces of silver to a caravan of Midianite traders bound for Egypt. In a single afternoon, Joseph went from a beloved heir to a piece of cargo. He was headed toward a foreign land, separated from his father and everything he knew. While it looked like his life had been derailed, this was actually the start of a sequence of events that would eventually save the very brothers who had cast him out. When the caravan arrived in Egypt, Joseph was sold again. He was purchased by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. In Egypt, Joseph was a slave. He had no rights, he had no family, and no path back home. He was a stranger in a land of idols, serving in the house of a powerful military man. However, Joseph decided to work with excellence. Even in a house that wasn't his, in a country he didn't choose, he applied himself. The Bible says God was with Joseph, and Potiphar noticed. Everything Joseph managed flourished. Soon, Potiphar promoted him to oversee his entire household. For a moment, it looked like Joseph had recovered. He was successful, trusted, and powerful within the walls of Potiphar's estate. But this recovery was an illusion. A new crisis was forming, and this time Joseph was completely innocent. Potiphar's wife began to pursue him, pressuring him to betray his master's trust. Joseph refused, citing his loyalty to Potiphar and his commitment to God. Angered by his rejection, she lied to her husband, accusing Joseph of the very crime he had refused to commit. Potiphar's fury was immediate. Joseph was arrested and taken from the heights of the estate to the king's prison. This wasn't a common jail, it was a dungeon for political prisoners. He was stripped of his position once again and left in a place where people were often forgotten forever. This chart tracks Joseph's status. You can see the sharp drop into the pit, followed by a brief rise while serving Potiphar. Then the line plummets even further into a deep trough, a place far lower than where he started. This was a season of isolation that would test whether he still believed in the dreams he had as a boy. In the dungeon, time is the enemy. Days turn into months, and months turn into years. For Joseph, there was no court date or lawyer. There was only the slow movement of shadows across the stone floor. Yet he chose not to let bitterness settle into his soul. He didn't give up on his character just because his circumstances were unfair. Even in prison, Joseph's gift for leadership emerged. The warden put him in charge of the other prisoners. Eventually, 2 of Pharaoh's own servants, his cupbearer and his baker, were thrown into the dungeon. Both men had troubling dreams on the same night. Joseph didn't ignore them. He listened to them and interpreted their dreams. He told the cupbearer he would be restored, and the baker that he would be executed. Joseph made one request to the cupbearer: "Remember me when you are back in the palace. Tell Pharaoh about me." The interpretations came true exactly as Joseph said. The cupbearer was restored to his place at Pharaoh's side, but in his joy, he completely forgot about the man who had helped him. Joseph was left in the dark for 2 more years. This period of silence was the hardest part of the journey. Every human door had closed. He had been a faithful son, a faithful slave, and a faithful prisoner, yet he was still in chains. This was the time when his reliance on his own abilities had to die, so that he could rely entirely on God's timing. While Joseph sat in the dungeon, the most powerful man in the world was losing sleep. Pharaoh had dreams no one in Egypt could explain. He saw 7 fat cows eaten by 7 thin cows, and 7 healthy ears of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. The magicians and wise men of Egypt were silent. The empire was facing a mystery it couldn't solve. Finally, the cupbearer remembered. He told Pharaoh about the Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams. In an instant, Joseph was summoned. He was hurried out of the dungeon, shaved, given clean clothes, and brought before the king of Egypt. 2 years of silence ended in a single moment of urgent demand. Pharaoh told his dreams, and Joseph gave him the answer. He explained that Egypt was about to experience 7 years of record-breaking harvests. There would be more food than the country knew what to do with. This chart shows the reality of Pharaoh's dream. A massive curve of abundance is followed immediately by a collapse. Joseph warned that 7 years of severe famine would follow to years of plenty, making people forget there was ever enough to eat. The skill Joseph had practiced in the prison, interpreting dreams for individual servants, was now the key to saving the entire empire. His life in the shadows had prepared him for the greatest crisis Egypt had ever faced. Pharaoh recognized that Joseph's wisdom wasn't ordinary. He saw a man who didn't just identify a problem, but had a strategy to solve it. Pharaoh realized that Joseph was the only person capable of managing the coming disaster. In a move that shocked the Egyptian court, Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Joseph was no longer a slave or a prisoner. He was the second in command of all Egypt. Joseph was now responsible for the survival of the nation. He traveled throughout Egypt, building storehouses and collecting grain during the years of plenty. He held the keys to the food supply of the ancient world. This timeline shows the path of his life. The deep valleys of the pit and the prison look like a failure of his destiny, but they provided the preparation for his rise. He finished his journey at a height far higher than where he began in his father's house. The famine arrived exactly as Joseph predicted. It was so widespread that it reached back to Canaan, where Joseph's family still lived. Jacob, hearing there was grain in Egypt, sent his sons to buy food so they wouldn't starve. When the brothers arrived in Egypt, they were brought before the man in charge of the grain. They didn't recognize the powerful Egyptian ruler as the brother they had sold 13 years earlier. They bowed their faces to the ground before him, fulfilling the very dreams they had tried to stop by throwing him in the pit. Joseph looked down at the men who had planned to kill him. He had the power to have them arrested, enslaved, or executed with a single word. This was the moment of absolute power over his enemies. The test was no longer about Joseph's survival. It was about his heart. Would he use his high position to settle an old debt, or would he choose a different path? Joseph could no longer hide his identity. He sent his guards away and wept so loudly that the entire palace heard him. He told his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers were terrified, but Joseph pulled them close. He didn't offer revenge, he offered a home. Joseph then spoke the words that explain his entire journey. "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph's story suggests that the most difficult chapters of a life aren't always what they seem. The very events meant to destroy him were the ones that positioned him to save his family and the world. The brothers intended to end Joseph's story in a pit, but that pit turned out to be the first step toward the palace. If you are in a season of struggle or betrayal, remember that the story isn't over yet. Trust that there is a purpose for the pain. Thank you for watching. If this story of Joseph moved you, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of